They're saying, no, you have to be tried in Georgia. Contextualize this for us. What does it mean?
Right. So today's decision from the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals represents a rejection of Mark Meadows, the former Trump chief of staff's effort to move his Georgia election interference case, which was brought in state court in Georgia, to federal court. The federal district court, who heard that motion initially, denied the motion, and so it went up on appeal. And the 11th Circuit, in a lengthy opinion, said, we agree with the district court that this case belongs in state court. It said, as a former federal official, Mark Meadows could not avail himself of the federal removal statute. So that was the first reason why it rejected his claim. But then it went on to look at essentially the merits or the facts of the case and said, even if you were not a former federal official, or even if former federal officials could avail themselves of removal, on the facts presented here, we do not think you were acting under color of your federal office. And that second part of the opinion really sort of doesn't look very good for the defendants in that case. Now, they are obviously taking the facts as presented to them without a fully developed record. There hasn't been a trial yet. But I would say the way that the facts were framed by the 11th Circuit in its opinion was not particularly favorable to Mark Meadows, and therefore, I think, to the other defendants in this case. But most significantly, in terms of what happens next for former President Trump, is that the trial court judge in state court in Georgia is now going to be free to set a trial date in that case. He was waiting to see what the 11th Circuit would say about the removal question, because if the case was going to be removed to federal court, there wouldn't be any point to going forward initially with a trial in state court. Now he knows that that case is going to stay in his courtroom, unless, of course, Meadows succeeds at taking it up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which is a possibility. But assuming that he does not succeed in that effort, then the case could go forward with a trial date in Georgia. And Trump is part of that large group of remaining defendants to go to trial in Georgia. It's unclear where there's room in the 2024 calendar for that trial to occur. But nevertheless, I think that's what's going to happen next in Georgia.
Well, this year ahead then might be starting to take shape, Professor. If that's the case, we get a date out of this in the Georgia case. We're also waiting to hear from the Supreme Court on this challenge to presidential immunity that would speak to Special Counsel Jack Smith's case, the election overturning case, the January 6th case, as opposed to the classified documents one. I'm just trying to keep everybody on the same line here. If the Supreme Court doesn't rule on that until, say, June, what would that mean for a start date of this trial?
Well, the trial date, which was going to be in March 2024, is stayed, held in abeyance until there is a decision on the immunity question. Because if Trump were correct that he is entitled to immunity from criminal prosecution, then what that means is he shouldn't be required to go to trial on that case. That's the significance of the immunity question. It's why he is given the ability to appeal that decision on immunity immediately to the appellate courts. The Supreme Court has moved expeditiously on the request to actually hear the special counsel's request for it to take the case before it goes before the D.C. Circuit. So the final briefs for President Trump are due on December 20th. That's lightning speed for the Supreme Court. And so we may have a decision from them, I think possibly next week, about whether they will take up the case. If they take the case, then they might have briefing and argument in January. If they continue at lightning speed, maybe we'd have a decision from them in January or February, but that's cutting it awfully close before a March trial date. And then most likely, if they rule he is not immune, then that trial date would have to be pushed back to some extent.
Justice Clarence Thomas is facing a number of calls to recuse himself, most notably because of his wife's work, text message she shared about the election with then Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows. Do you think he should be recusing himself from this immunity case?
There have
Professor?
I'm trying to digest that in the context of this particular case. There have been calls for Clarence Thomas to recuse himself previously from cases involving January 6th based on his wife's support of the efforts. I think those calls are well-founded. And thinking about it now in the context of the immunity question, that I'd have to think through as a legal matter, because it is a legal question that it's true is arising in the context of the January 6th case. I'd want to think that through more specifically in terms of the recusal with respect to the immunity question. I think it probably does rise and fall with respect to the underlying case, but I'd want to study it further.
Well, we appreciate a thoughtful response, as always, Professor. Based on everything that we've said in this conversation, is this shaping up to be a more difficult year for a man named Donald Trump to try to run for president again, or an easier one, as it seems like a lot of these trials, a lot of these cases are being moved back?
A lot is going to turn on how the Supreme Court rules. If it does take the case, if it decides first to take the case regarding immunity, and if it does take the case, how it rules on the immunity question substantively, because that will determine whether the special counsel's trial goes forward at all in the January 6th case. The Florida classified documents case is currently scheduled to go forward in May. The trial judge there has been moving quite slowly with respect to ruling on motions there. I believe there's a March 1 scheduling conference before her where she said she's going to decide whether to move that trial date back, but that remains on the docket as of now. For May, you've got the January criminal case brought by the Manhattan DA's office. Excuse me, that's also in March. There is the ongoing New York civil fraud trial in the New York State Court that the judge is going to rule on that in January. And then you have the Georgia case. So overall, yes, it's a very, very busy calendar for former President Trump. How that affects his election prospects, I really can't speak to. It does seem that he is often able to capitalize for political purposes on these cases, but certainly he will be busy because of these court proceedings.